most of the services that we will configure are going to be dependent on Active Directory being installed and fully configured. So even though it's early in the course, it's necessary that we cover Active Directory so you have an understanding of these terms and how to actually deploy Active Directory. Then we can go configure the rest of the services. Some things we want to be aware of. Just terminology, really. Active Directory is logical, and there's also a physical component to Active Directory. The physical component will be the servers. Logical components will be how it's actually designed. So the terms we care about: domains, domain trees, that's often just called trees, forest, OUs, and containers. So this is all going to be logical design components. On the physical side, we have these servers, domain controllers, and read-only domain controllers. A domain controller is just a server that has Active Directory domain services installed and configured, and a read-only domain controller, which is usually just called an RODC, is a domain controller with a read-only copy of Active Directory on it. So those are the two types that we actually will deploy. A domain in Active Directory is a repository for accounts. Now, they're often called accounts, sometimes they're called objects, but our user accounts that we create are computer accounts, groups, and many other things. It's also a replication boundary, meaning you can't have a single point of failure. You have multiple domain controllers that run Active Directory in your domain. If one of those were to fail, your users would simply be able to connect to the other domain controller, and they would still be able to authenticate, log on. They would never know you've had any type of failure. A domain is also an administrative boundary. You're going to have a set of administrators. We call them domain admins. They have full control over the objects within the domain. So if I'm a domain administrator and your user account is within my domain, I have full control over your user account as I do over all the other user accounts in the domain. Now, the server, physical side of this, is a domain controller. This is nothing but a server operating system that has Active Directory domain services installed and configured. So now it holds the user accounts, computer accounts, groups. You can think of it almost like an application or role you load on any server. Active Directory domain services is just the role that you would load to make a server a domain controller. To put a visual to these terms, I have my domain, which is named rts.com. Triangle is the symbol for a domain. Just anytime you see a graphic talking about a domain, it's always going to be a triangle. This name, rts.com, this is a fully qualified domain name, or FQDN. It's made up of at least two parts. We have the .com. Now, some people call this an extension. That's what I usually call it. But it's actually a top-level domain, or TLD, is the .com. Now, this is .com for no reason other than that's what I wanted it to be. It could have been net, org, or anything you make up, you actually pick. Now, if you plan to ever integrate this with the cloud, this needs to be an internet-compatible top-level domain. So it needs to be like a .com, net, something like that. In the past, its common domains ended with terms like .local. If you were to do that, it works fine, but you would have to change it before you could actually integrate with Microsoft Azure or Amazon Web Services or anything like that. Then we just have RTS. Well, that is just the domain name. Usually that somehow references your company, but it's whatever you want that to be. So that's the logical side. Now, in the domain, we're going to have our user accounts. We're going to have our computer accounts. They all reside in the domain. So logically, that's how it's organized. Physically, this is nothing but Server 2019 with Active Directory domain services installed on it. So you go to Active Directory and you create the user accounts, you create the computer accounts, groups, and all the other objects. They just reside on Server 2019. This is one of those things that I always say is 99% planning, 1% implementation. So that's a domain. A forest. A forest is a security boundary. We said a domain was an administrative boundary. It's also one or more domains that make up and share this trust relationship. Now that brings up the question, what is a trust? A trust is a relationship between multiple domains that allows access to resources in other domains within the same forest. Now, this trust is actually created by default. So it's not something you manually have to go create when you're setting up, multiple domains in your forest, but we want to know what it is because that term will come up for us. This would be a picture of a forest. So I have my domain, rts.com. I also have a child domain, india.rts.com. Now, the child domain has the top level domain. It has the domain name. I'm just going to put name. And it has the subdomain name. I'm just going to call that sub name. With this, I can look at the name india.rts.com, and we know the name of this domain itself is India. rts.com, the parent domain, so we'll just call this a parent. We'll call this a child. But this rts.com gets appended, so that's how you know it's child domain. So this is india.rts.com. It is very common. This is done for location reasons. Let's say rts.com. That is your headquarters location. You have a very large office in India, but it's not your headquarters location. So we're just going to call it a branch, like a branch office. You make it its own domain. It has its own administrators and all that, but you want it to be a child domain of RTS. This is actually called a tree. So I would call this the rts.com tree, is what we would actually call it. So within the forest, we have a tree. So this tree has two domains. Now on the other side, I have another domain, Atlantis.com. So we know the top level domain is com, Atlantis is the domain name. Then under that, we have two child domains. I have us.atlantis.com and I have ca for Canada.atlantis.com. This is also a tree. Now, this entire picture is the forest. Now, this can be a little confusing. I know sometimes it may seem like, what's the point of it all? Why do I need multiple trees? Why do I need multiple forests? But one way to think of it, let's say I have a group of administrators here. They work in RTS. They are responsible for everything in RTS. They manage every user that works in the headquarters location. They manage every computer account. But our office in India, let's say it's a pretty large office. It's another group of admins that work here. They are responsible for everything in India. They have complete autonomy over their configuration. They manage their users, computers. Well, then it makes perfect sense for them to have their own domain to be part of that structure. Now, Atlantis.com and RTS. In this example, let's say they are all part of the same company, but they're like different lines of business. In my hometown, there's a company, Philip Morris. Well, that used to be their name. They are actually a cigarette manufacturer. Now they're named Altria, but I'd still call them Philip Morris. Well, Philip Morris also owns Kraft. Now, realistically, these are two separate companies. They're just owned by the same parent company. But one sells cigarettes, the other sells mayonnaise. These are two completely different lines of business. We just call them LOB. Cigarettes and the products that Crafts make, like macaroni and cheese and mayonnaise, they have no relationship to each other. So there is no chance that I want to have email addresses or domain names that are for people that work at Kraft to reference Philip Morris, because you'd be thinking about cigarettes and mayonnaise. Those two thoughts do not go together. They look to be independent organizations. So for us, this is the same thing I want to have here. RTS, maybe they sell some type of product. Atlantis is part of the same company. They just sell some different type of product, but they have these different appearances, different branding, different names. If that's true, then I create a separate tree in the forest. If everything was under RTS, then I would have had all these be child domains under RTS. This is 100% design. And when I say design, what I mean, I can't really tell you, no one can tell you that, oh, in this situation, this should be a child domain or this should be a tree. It completely depends on what the objective is in the organization that you are in. Now with this, I'm going to change colors here. What we have are these trust relationships. So these lines here represent a trust. And I have these, I'm going to put little arrows on them. What this means to me, let's say there is a user in the ca.atlantis.com, Bob. There is a shared folder in India. So there's a file server over here. My file server has a shared folder. I'm just going to say it's named, we'll just write share for it. What I want to have happen, I need Bob and maybe some of Bob's coworkers that work in the CA domain, they need access to this file share. Well, what I can do, I can go to the properties of this folder, and when I click on the security tab, I can assign permissions. But what I will see is a list of all the domains in the forest because we have this trust relationship. So on the security tab here, when I want to assign permissions, I'm just going to write perm. So when I want to assign my permissions, I can click on this ca.atlantis.com and I'll see users and groups that show up. And I could select, say, a group that has Bob as a member of it, and I could ultimately grant Bob access to this shared folder. So we're still administered completely different. Each one of these domains has its own set of administrators, but we can share applications, we can share files, all those types of things within the environment itself. Still all design. So now we have defined the term domain. We know what a tree is. A parent domain and any child domains below would be a tree. And a forest would be a collection that all share this common trust relationship so they can share resources between one and the other. This is basically the same graphic, but when you design any domain, you're going to have at a minimum 2 domain controllers. So I'm going to call this domain controller A and B. We'll say C and D. I'll just call this E and F. Every domain is going to have, at a minimum, 2 domain controllers. The reason, you can't have a single point of failure. So let's say my user here, Bob. Bob, if I create this on domain controller E, it actually replicates to the other domain controller. So Bob gets replicated to domain controller F. Let's say domain controller E, the hard drive crashes. Well, now, when Bob tries to log in the morning, he can simply authenticate through domain controller F. If domain controller F were to crash, we would assume that E would be online. Now, we're assuming both of these are unlikely to crash at exactly the same time. However, that's certainly possible, but does give us a level of redundancy. So at a minimum, you'd want to have 2 domain controllers, but all the objects in Active Directory are identical. It does not matter which one you create a user on, a computer, does not matter. It simply replicates to the other. So I could create Bob Ross on domain controller E. I could go to domain controller F and I could delete Bob Ross, and it would simply replicate the fact that Bob has been deleted and he disappears off of domain controller E. Now, this is only within your domain that they replicate. So these two domain controllers here are exact replicas of each other, but they only contain objects like users, computers in this ca.atlantis.com domain. In the Atlantis.com, you have your domain controllers here. They're going to contain all the users in this domain. The US, same thing. They're going to contain all the user accounts that you ever create in the us.atlantis.com. Our india.rts and our RTS, same thing. In reality, a domain controller is actually just a database server. It has a database file on it, which is actually named ntds.dit. You don't have to know that. That's not important, really, ever. Just a fact. But what happens, this little ntds.dit file lives on both domain controllers. So anytime you create an object, you modify an object, they keep checking each other for changes, and anything that changes on either side simply replicates to the other within your domain. So we have, in this picture, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 domains. I have 2 trees. We know the Atlantis.com child domains below our tree, and the RTS.com, any child domains it have, would be 1 tree. And we have 1 forest. So that would be our design. Now, the hallmark of a forest is this trust relationship between these domains, so they can share resources. Now, our last thought on this graphic. Let's say you do not need to share resources. RTS.com, Atlantis.com, they may be part of the same company, but they do 2 very different things, and nothing ever crosses over. Users that work on the RTS side, they never have a need to share resources or applications with users in Atlantis. If that's true, you simply do not put them in the same forest. You would have your RTS forest as one complete separate forest, and you'd have Atlantis as a completely separate forest. Again, this all goes back to, well, design and planning, just depending on what your needs are. Now, these terms come up when we look at a lot of the services in Active Directory. So we just want to make sure we have a handle on terms like domain, domain controller, tree, forest. So when they get referenced when we're configuring some of these other services, we know what they are.